So to talk about how innovation, how ethics, and how trust kind of mingle together, we have our next keynote to cover that stuff. And to talk about that, we have an incredible speaker. She's a Chief Strategy Officer at EMEA and Executive Leadership Sponsor for Inclusiveness and Corporate Citizenship at FTI Consulting. She's an active member of Women for Tech, by the way, big fan. Active member of Tech for Good. Prior to her current position, she worked for 12 years at Ernst & Young, at EY. Among the things she was spearheading there, she was working in the complex performance improvement program with her clients. So she's being on the front run of how complex these technology problems are and how it impacts people. So please welcome our next speaker on stage, Caroline Dasmonfreux. Big applause, guys.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I was really heartened to see the kids on stage earlier because what I'd like to talk to you about today is going to impact the next generation and probably the generations after that. So, a bit of background. For the last 2 decades, I've been working across all industries: retail, consumer products, technology, media, communications, financial services, with big companies, medium companies, startups, about their innovation. And I think what I take from that is 2 things. First of all, the future is very, very exciting. I mean, we've seen this at South Summit. There is so much change happening in the world right now. And digital and technology is going to reinvent everything. We will live longer, we will live better, hopefully, and we're going to see more clean sources of energy. There's just so much going on right now, and it's exciting. But there's one thing that we're not talking about enough, which is all the data that's being created and the implications of that. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is the concept of unintended consequences. That's the consequences that we're not thinking about right now. Innovation is great, but we've got to think about how it can be used and for what purpose. So a bit of background in terms of the scale of the data that we're creating right now. We've got 3.7 billion humans on this planet connected to the internet. That's half the world connected to the internet. The other half hasn't come online yet, but it will at some point. With 3.7 billion humans on the planet, we're creating 2.5 quintillion bytes of data every day. That's such a big number, I can't even put it on the screen. We're creating a lot of data right now. And every day, every week, every month, we're creating more data. Now, that data is everything. It's your payment information, it's your identity data, it's commercial data, customer data. There's just so much of it being created right now. Some of it is created by businesses. Some of it is created by governments. There's just a lot of it floating around right now. And what's really interesting is that, for the moment, those databases are not connected. But what happens when all the data that we have created, all the data that we keep on creating, starts coming together? Because it's not just about the data. There's this concept of analytics. We're seeing that data being stored in the cloud. And then with analytics and machine learning, we can start making sense of the data. We can use it. We can put 2 and 2 together. We can create new perspectives on people, on businesses, on countries, on governments. That data can be very, very powerful. And it's not just the intangible. By 2020, there will be 200 billion objects connected to the internet. 200 billion objects connected to the internet. There's only 7 billion people on the planet. Can you imagine the scale of that? So the data that's being created is not just created by online transactions as we think of it right now. It's also data about all the things that surround us. Not just our phones, but our smart homes, our smart cities. We're basically living in an era that's pinned on a platform that is enabled by data. So data is the new oil. And I want to talk about that today because I don't know if you've come across this concept of unintended consequences. Has anyone heard the story of the monarch butterflies? No? OK, so there's a very big business in the US. It's an agribusiness. It's one of the biggest producers of food in the world. And what they did was, a few years ago, they embraced innovation. They thought, we can use innovation to increase crops, to reduce the waste, to make sure that the seeds that we plant give us better returns, less waste, more money, right? So they engineered the seeds and worked on different types of pesticides and applied those to millions and millions of acres of agriculture. And it worked. It worked very well. The yields were higher. The crops were growing better. It worked fantastically well. But then something started happening. Monarch butterflies started to die. There's been 900 million monarch butterflies that have died since 1990. Now you would think, two separate issues. But actually, the pesticides and the genetic engineering of those seeds resulted in some insects not being around anymore. Monarch butterflies eat those. And so as a result, the monarch butterflies started to die. And then you start seeing a chain of consequences, because there are birds that eat those. So when you change something in an ecosystem, it has a ripple effect. And that's what I want to talk about today, because the data we're creating can have unintended consequences. We don't know what those consequences are just yet, but I'd like to give you two examples. I'd like to give you an example of how institutions and governments change and what that means for data. And then I'd like to talk to you about the darker side of the web and cyber issues. So you might have come across this in the papers. There was a program that was launched by Barack Obama in 2012 called the Dreamers program in the US. The idea there was that there were millions of Mexican immigrants on US territory, and those had been living in the US for a really long time. They had children. There were children born on US territory that were illegal, and there were many people like that. The Obama government said, we need to rectify the situation. And the government said to people, come forward. You are illegal, but if you come forward and you tell us who you are, you will be safe, and we will help you get US citizenship, and you will basically be integrated into society. 800,000 illegal immigrants came forward as part of the Dreamers program. And the government at the time kept its promise. It processed those applications, etc. But then a few years later, Donald Trump was elected. And Donald Trump had very different views on immigration. And what he tried to do was to basically revoke the DACA program. So all those immigrants who stepped forward and said, I exist, gave their data, suddenly ended up in an environment where they were not safe anymore. They could be prosecuted. They could be deported. Now, the law hasn't been revoked just yet, because there are institutions that are slowing down the process. But ultimately, the point here is that governments can change, institutions can change, geopolitical dynamics can change. But what doesn't change is that once your data is out there, it's out there forever. Those people now are on the map. And it's just an example, and I won't share my personal political views on this. But the bottom line is that we need to think carefully about what data we're sharing and how it might be used. And if we're sharing our data, we also need to think about the infrastructure in place that will make sure we abide by some principles around democracy, around freedom of expression, and around respect. Because we've learned from history that things sometimes don't go according to plan. And what really worries me here is that it's not just identity data we're talking about here. I don't know if you have that in Spain, but in the UK, you can do a property search. So you can look for an address in a neighborhood in London, for example. And then you can click on the neighborhood and get a breakdown of how many Christians live in the area, how many Muslims live in the area. You can get a breakdown by socioeconomic status. You can see kind of the range of earnings for the people living there. You can actually narrow it down to who lives where, who they are, what religion they are, what race they are. And there's a lot of data like that being connected in the cloud. The other thing that worries me is that we're also starting to capture human genome data, DNA data. There's a startup called 23andMe, I don't know if any of you have done that, who basically takes some DNA samples from you, and in exchange, they give you back a full report around your DNA makeup. So they will tell you how likely you are to get Alzheimer's. They will tell you which type of cancer you might be susceptible to. And it's great. I mean, who doesn't want to know that? You can actually have a customized view of your genetic makeup. And as a result, you can take preventive action. You can, exercise more. You can decide to take, medicines that will slow down or avoid any of these potential diseases. So that's great. But as a result, we also now have DNA data on the cloud. 5 million people have their DNA data on the cloud. And in a year's time, it's probably going to be 2 or 3 times that amount. Imagine if that information about race, religion, and DNA was on the cloud in 1945. So we've got to think about that. So there's an official side to the story, and then there's the unofficial side to the story, which is the cybersecurity and kind of hacker view of the world. Now, I work in a business that helps companies address things when they go wrong. So, we specialize in cybersecurity, we specialize in data breach, we specialize in managing things that have not gone according to plan. And it's really scary to see what goes on in the background. Most of us aren't aware of it. Sometimes British Airways gets hacked and we see it in the newspaper, but it happens every day. And that data gets sold on the dark web. So there's a risk around the kind of the official view of the world, but there's also a risk around what goes on the kind of in the 5th dimension, if you like, kind of the dark kind of underground web. And I really want to think about that because ultimately, the people in this room, businesses, startups, governments, all of us have a duty to ask ourselves some questions. Questions around innovation, purpose, and also questions around how we might start to create the checks and balances that we need to have in place in the system to make sure that we're not creating a future that's probably not the future we want for our children. And right now, there is no system in place to prevent any of these unintended consequences. There's a lot of leadership coming from large corporates. So all the big tech companies have created a consortium, for example, that's exploring some of these ethical questions around artificial intelligence. I go to many innovation conferences like this, and there's always a discussion around, how might we take preventative action. But ultimately, it's the collaboration in ecosystems that's going to make a difference. And to start that collaboration, we really need to have a dialogue around how we're going to create data, how we're going to capture it, how we're going to store it, and how we're going to protect it. And that is not something that one company can do alone. It has to be a collaboration. It has to be a dialogue. Most importantly, we've got a lot of coverage online around some of the negative sides. But I don't believe the negative side is helpful here. What we need is a vision, a positive vision around what kind of society do we want to create tomorrow. How can we make sure it's fair? Can we really have a true democracy in an environment where elections can be hacked, where fake news cannot be prevented? We really need to think about some of the principles we take for granted. Because those principles will need to be brought to life in a different way in a digital age. And to do that, we need to paint a picture. We need to start the conversation. We really need to think about how the system is going to work. Because if we don't have a vision, we won't know how to work together to make it happen. And I honestly believe that regulation is not the answer either, because regulation plays catch-up. We need to be more agile. From what I've seen in so many industries, businesses are always 3 steps ahead in terms of the innovation, in terms of the technologies, in terms of the use cases and the applications that they're creating. So it needs to be a dialogue. It needs to be a collective effort. And I hope that all of you here will play a role somehow in making sure that the dialogue keeps happening, that we have a vision around how we're going to create a society that is underpinned by data, because there is no stopping it. It's just accelerating, it's getting bigger, and it's exciting. We are really, I think, at a turning point in humanity in terms of the society we're creating for ourselves. We've got to make sure it's a good one. Any questions? Or comments?
Yeah, I have a question. As you mentioned, you say the companies need to cooperate with each other to form allies, so to protect the data. But as I know, the companies are also sharing data with each other. Cross-check. Thank you. The companies, they're collude with each other. Some company may have payment data of the customer, some company may have the commercial data. They cooperate with each other so that they can have a full image of the individuals.
Yeah.
So if they're doing like this, how can they cooperate and protect the data?
That's a great question. So just to repeat for everyone, so the question is around the sharing of data between different companies and how to make sure that that happens in the right way. What I've observed in many sectors is that the magic ingredient in that ecosystem is trust. So there are different levels to that. The first level is commercial trust, because very often to operate in a market that's convergent. So by convergence, I mean, I'll give you the example of retail and consumer products. So now we're seeing marketplaces that sit across different industries that are enabled by digital, enabled by tech. But ultimately, you've got 4 or 5 industry sectors that are playing. So I'll give you an example. If you think about the concept of smart cities, and I think we'll hear from the other speakers on smart cities later on, you now have cities that have smart buildings, where you can have smart meters, so you can manage energy in a different way. We're now seeing some collaboration between real estate and insurance and future of mobility solutions. So all these industries are coming together. To your point, it's the data that underpins that collaboration. But then when different industries come together, they start saying, well, this data is mine. I'm not sharing that data with X because it's my business model. If I share that data, I'm giving away my competitive advantage. Also, very often what we find is that there is a missing piece in the jigsaw puzzle, and that piece is trust. So, I've worked on projects where there were 6 or 7 different companies who wanted to work together, but they needed someone neutral in the middle to basically take the data from the different parties, put it on the cloud, create the analytics platform, create the cybersecurity to protect it, but also make sure that different people were putting things in, getting things out, in a way that worked with the principles that were agreed. So to answer your question, the key to making this work is to agree the principles. What are the principles? When we think about how that data is going to be used, is there a do no harm principle? We don't want to make things worse, right? But then there's a second level, which is actually, could we make things better? Is it the role of business to make things better? It's a big question. And then the third one is around, if we are going to work together and have that data shared, How do we make sure it is shared in a way that's been agreed by the different parties and everyone knows what they're doing? Because if we don't have that trust, if we don't have those principles, it's not going to work.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.